Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Road to World War II, 1938 by Epic History. Now last time we saw Italy and Ethiopia, the continuation of the brutal Spanish Civil War. We saw the outbreak of war between Japan and China, an event that many see as the actual beginning of the Second World War, and we ended with continued negotiations, appeasement from the Western powers towards Germany. Today we're heading into 1938, so we're getting increasingly close to the outbreak of the war, at least on the European continent. Excuse me if my voice sounds a little bit different. I've been a little sick lately. If you see any weird cuts, that's probably me taking a break to cough up a lung. Hopefully not. But anyway, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, or check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. There is no question of ever accepting Nazi representatives in the Austrian cabinet. An absolute abyss separates Austria from Nazism. And the Chancellor, yeah, well, we'll see how that goes in this episode. Anschluss, we're getting right into it.
In Germany, Hitler's repudiation of the Versailles Peace Treaty and reassertion of German military power and prestige has won him enormous popularity.
Yeah, I mean, look, Germany had been rearming for a while. I mean, even sort of secretly, it had not been living up to the agreement, the Treaty of Versailles. But especially over the last couple of years, it's become increasingly obvious and increasingly public. And in fact, Hitler is publicizing all of this because it's very popular among the people of Germany. I mean, Versailles was a very harsh treaty, very punitive towards Germany. And so a lot of Germans, even if they weren't far-righters, they were opposed to the Treaty of Versailles, and they were glad to see it being flouted. Now, of course, all of this is going to have disastrous consequences, but this certainly helped Hitler gain some popularity.
But some at the top of Germany's military and diplomatic corps are worried by the pace of events. They include War Minister von Blomberg, Head of the Army General von Fritsch, and Foreign Minister von Neurath. All have raised concerns that Hitler's plans for territorial expansion risk another war with Britain and France.
Yeah, well, there were different perspectives on this among the politicians and leaders in Germany. A lot of the sort of Nazi politicians felt that a war was inevitable, and they were just going to have to prepare for it. Now, even a lot of those guys felt that they needed a few more years to prepare. They're not going to get a few more years to prepare. It's going to start in 1939, right, as we know. Then, of course, there were some who were not so on board, and they were like, now, wait a minute, maybe I like all this German rearmament and ignoring the Treaty of Versailles, but I don't really want to get us into a war, and since you're doing this all so rapidly and so openly, you're really testing the waters here.
A war Germany is not ready to fight. Hitler now gets rid of them all. Von Neurath is replaced with the more hawkish Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former ambassador to Britain and a loyal Nazi.
And so shows you the true power that Hitler has at this point. I mean, he's got popularity, he's got power within the government and even within the military. And that's the big thing here. Weimar Germany had been an often unstable government, right? Often under threat, not only from protesters and radicals and Freikorps, but also under threat from its own military, sometimes more or less openly, right? So taking over the government was one thing, but winning the loyalty and then controlling the military was another thing, and now Hitler, you can see he's fully managed to do that as well.
Von Blomberg and von Fritsch are both linked to sex scandals, real and invented, and forced to resign. The new Commander-in-Chief of Germany's armed forces, the Wehrmacht, will be Adolf Hitler.
Oh, how about that?
The Führer then turns his attention to Austria, the land of his birth, that he believes to be an integral part of the greater German nation.
Yeah, and, this was not an idea that originated with Hitler, right? I mean, there had been this idea of German nationhood for a while, even if we go backwards into the 19th century. If you think of the nationalism of that century, the struggles of the revolutions of 1848, before there was a unified German state, there was this feeling of nationalism that really united Germans, regardless of what state they were in. And so at that time, you've got Austria and Prussia and Bavaria and all these different German states. No one knew, would there be a Germany? A lot of Germans wanted that. Some didn't. What would the borders of this German state be? It was possible that they would include Austria with its, German-speaking population. Now, of course, in the end, that's not what happens, right? The unification of Germany happens later in the 19th century under the auspices of one Otto von Bismarck, who basically leads it as this very Prussia-forward exercise. And so the Germany that we get is really centered around this Prussian expansionism, and Austria does not end up being included. However, that does not end this idea of a greater Germany. Of course, that was an idea central to the Nazi ideology, the idea that these Aryan Germans were superior, racially superior, and that, first of all, the German Reich should include all Germans in its territory, and second of all, that the Germans needed Lebensraum, or living space, meaning they would have to conquer lots of territory, particularly to the east, Poland, for example, kick out, kill, or enslave the Poles so Germans could colonize the area, right? So this was all very integral to that Nazi ideology, and the Nazis would talk about it pretty openly, in fact, and from pretty early on.
In February, he demands that Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg put leading Nazis in charge of his police force and economy. Under extraordinary pressure from his much larger neighbour, Schuschnigg announces a referendum. Austrians will decide for themselves whether they want to become part of Germany, a union known as Anschluss. Hitler is furious. He expects any referendum to be rigged. He orders German military units to the border and demands Schuschnigg's resignation. On the 11th of March, Schuschnigg resigns. German units roll into Austria the next day anyway, on the pretext of restoring law and order.
So, this is obviously, by far, the most inflammatory action that a newly rearmed Germany has taken. Even before they march into the country, it's obvious that they pose a legitimate military threat to Austria. No one can pretend otherwise. And now they've literally marched in and taken Austria, right? We've seen the strategy of appeasement and negotiation, where Hitler flouts all aspects of Versailles, and people go, well, it's not so bad, or well, it was harsh anyway, But this is, like I said, the most inflammatory action he has taken yet. Now he is openly just seizing sovereign territory, right? Sovereign countries, and taking it for his new Reich. So let's see what the aftermath, the international response will be.
Austrian units are ordered not to resist by the new Chancellor, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, leader of the Austrian Nazi Party. The question of Anschluss has bitterly divided Austria. Many passionately support it and turn out in their thousands to welcome German troops. Hitler arrives later that day, stopping briefly in his hometown, before making a triumphal entry into Vienna on the 14th of March.
Yes, interesting. Hitler, the Nazis start with the relatively bloodless conquests, right? Austria, and we'll see the Sudetenland, and then it escalates as we get to Poland. So it's almost like they're sort of testing the waters, and that kind of is what they're doing. And we've seen this throughout the series, where each step of the way, they're getting more and more inflammatory. But they're sort of, ramping it up over time and seeing, will, France and Britain put a stop to us? Will they invade? Will they take military action? We'll see how far we can go. And each step, Hitler finds that he can go further and further and further, right? And of course, that is the danger of this appeasement strategy. Well, the problem is that Hitler was never appeased, right? Each time they gave in, he went, great, let me go one step further.
Later, a thoroughly rigged Austrian referendum returns a result of 99.7% approval for Anschluss.
How about that?
Away from the celebrations, the Nazis begin rounding up political opponents, including ex-Chancellor Schuschnigg, who'll spend the next 7 years in a concentration camp.
Sheesh.
Viennese Jews are targeted and beaten by Austrian Nazis, aided by the German invaders. Several are murdered.
Yeah, and this is, of course, a part of the Nazi occupation, right? Nazis will occupy lots of territory throughout Europe, and wherever they occupy, terror follows. Terror, particularly against the Jewish population, but also against other minority populations and against political opponents. And oftentimes, this sort of reign of terror is often carried out by local occupiers with their Nazi allies, right? And so after the war, of course, everyone points the fingers at the German Nazis, and rightfully so, but there are a lot of occupiers throughout Europe. A lot of them get punished, some of them get away with it, because some of them say, oh, well, I really had no choice, I had to do this, and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, well, not everybody decided to collaborate, right? And oftentimes collaborators were treated very badly after the war. I'm just making the point, though, that wherever the Nazis occupied, you could find local collaborators. Now, you could also find people who were resisting, people who were saving lives. There were heroic acts of resistance, but also a lot of collaboration.
Others are made to scrap.
I mean, especially in countries that already had pretty virulent right-wing movements, which were a lot of countries at this time. They may not necessarily have been Nazi movements or fascist movements, but there was some overlap in a lot of these countries, and in Austria, pretty direct overlap.
And invaders. Several are murdered. Others are made to scrub anti-Nazi slogans off the street in front of jeering crowds.
Ish.
Britain protests impotently, as does France, though in the midst of the crisis, distracted by the fall of yet another government.
Yeah, see, this is the issue with having so much government instability, is that it really weakens you in times of crisis. Not that there necessarily would have been a strong response otherwise. Britain's doing the equivalent of writing a strongly worded letter. We really don't agree with this. We're not really going to do anything about it, but we don't like what you're doing, shaking the finger.
The only power that might have meaningfully intervened is Italy. It was Mussolini, after all, who'd prevented Hitler's attempted annexation in 1934. But the two dictators are now firm allies.
Yeah, and we've seen this throughout the series, how initially, I think people are often surprised by this, Italy actually could have sort of blocked Germany because Mussolini was a little nervous about German expansion, into Austria, closer to Italy, essentially. But Mussolini and Hitler have managed to form this pact, in part because Mussolini's come to believe that the Western Allies are totally feckless, which they are. They've also bonded over giving aid to Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and so now Mussolini will not stand in Hitler's way, and now we're truly on the path to Hitler being the number one and Mussolini being the number two. Right? I mean, Mussolini's the first to do it. Hitler is actually following in his footsteps, but Hitler becomes the leading partner.
As both continue to build their new empires.
It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future. Right, so we go from Austria to Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, Munich.
By May 1938, the United States is sufficiently alarmed by Japan's attack on China and the threat of war in Europe to begin rearming. That month, Congress passes the Second Vinson Act to increase the strength of the US Navy by 20%.
Yeah, so we've seen that up to this point, the Congress, the people of the United States, have taken a bit of an isolationist slant after the First World War and after the difficulties of the Great Depression. They're not really interested in getting involved in conflicts around the world. However, FDR, Roosevelt, he's very concerned about what is going on abroad. He, in fact, is sort of ahead of his own population. So he's already kind of pushing in that direction. Not necessarily to get directly involved yet, but he wants to make sure that he can influence the outcomes if necessary. And you can see even at this point that the Congress is like, okay, things are starting to look bad. Japan is looking increasingly aggressive. And of course, the United States and Japan are these competing Pacific powers. So the U.S. is not necessarily involved yet, at least not deeply, but they are beginning their rearmament.
Hitler, meanwhile, turns to his next target, as outlined in the Hossbach Memorandum of 1937, Czechoslovakia. More than 3 million ethnic Germans live in areas of the country they call the Sudetenland.
Right, so this once again fits in with that idea I was talking about earlier of German nationalism, especially at this point under the Nazis. They want to unite the German peoples under their Third Reich. And of course, this can be the danger with nationalism, especially extreme nationalism generally, is, in the desire, the process of creating a nation state. Well, the idea of a nation state is you have a state for a nation, and especially if you define that nation ethnically, then that can lead to exclusion of those who do not fit into that particular group, which throughout history, especially at this time of history, led to a lot of extreme violence, death, and brutality.
Many want union with Germany. Hitler intends to launch a short war to bring these Sudeten Germans within the Reich, while also blooding his new military and destroying Czechoslovakia, which he regards as a fake nation created by the Versailles Treaty. In theory, France and the Soviet Union have pledged to defend Czechoslovakia from attack. Britain's position is more vague. The country is still woefully unprepared for conflict, and its public will not stomach war with Germany over a pro-German region of Czechoslovakia. Instead, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain hopes stern warnings and the threat of intervention will be enough to deter Hitler from attack.
I guess we'll see.
In May, there are reports of a German military build-up on the Czech frontier. The rumors are false, but trigger a major war scare across Europe.
I will say, I was speaking about nationalism just a moment ago. This strategy that Hitler uses, where he says, well, there's a German population here, so we need to take that land. It's a somewhat similar strategy we've seen used by a couple of different people, including Putin, right? This is what Putin sometimes does, not just in Ukraine, but with Russian minorities in a bunch of different post-Soviet countries, where he says, well, this country has a Russian minority, that's our responsibility, and thus we should have some influence. Now, that doesn't mean he always invades, but sometimes he does, right? I mean, that's a big part of there's a lot of reasons for the invasion of Ukraine, but Putin basically says that, well, the people in eastern Ukraine, they're not even really Ukrainian, they should be part of Russia. And, now the people in the east of Ukraine definitely don't want to be part of Russia. after being bombed and attacked by Russia for years. But anyway, you see that thing, and that sort of idea of, well, we need to be protecting our national minorities even when they're abroad. That has led to abuses in a lot of countries, the Baltic countries in particular, right? And so that's a strategy we see repeated.
Civilians in cities expect to be bombed within hours of war being declared. Military experts have predicted as much. Many will soon be issued masks in case poison gas is used. The crisis rolls on that summer as the German military prepares for Case Green, an attack on Czechoslovakia scheduled for early October. Hitler has already guessed that Britain and France will not intervene to save the Czechs. Just in case, he gives orders to strengthen Germany's western frontier defences, the Westwall, and to speed up U-boat and battleship production.
See, and this is where, of course, Hitler is concerned with taking territory, right? The conquest, Anschluss, taking the Sudetenland, expanding eastwards. But at this point, he's also obviously preparing for war with the Western powers, right? With Britain and France. He's building up to that point. Of course, hindsight's 2020. But you're sort of saying, like, there should have been a much earlier intervention. And, I know sometimes people will say, like, well, these politicians didn't know what was coming, and how could they have known, and they didn't want to get into a war. And sure, but there were those at the time, like a Churchill, who even at this point were saying, no, this is no good. We need to be getting involved. We need to be stopping Germany. In fact, Germany should have been stopped far prior to this. But of course, the League of Nations was toothless, the international community was totally feckless. We have a similar situation with the UN today. The UN has no real ability to stop anybody doing anything, right? And, I mean, honestly, if this, you could expect the same type of response today is what I'm saying. But obviously, when you look at this, you're like, oh my god, Hitler's getting away with everything he wants to do, right up till that invasion of Poland.
But several German generals remain deeply alarmed by Hitler's plan. They warn Hitler that if the French do intervene, Germany's western defences will be overrun in weeks. General Beck, chief of the General Staff, resigns. He will later become a leading plotter against Hitler.
Whoa. The idea that safety can be purchased by throwing a small state to the wolves is a fatal delusion. What, didn't I just mention Churchill? There you go. That's exactly what I was saying.
By September, German forces really are mobilizing on the Czech border. In speeches, Hitler falsely accuses the Czechs of abusing and terrorizing Sudeten Germans.
See, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is exactly what Putin does today, where he claims there's been abuses of Russian minorities or Russian speakers. The same blueprint is repeated time and time again. And that, of course, that abuse, that justifies intervention of some sort.
An intolerable outrage that he will end.
Deutschland nicht bereit ist, dem Leid und Leben einer Summe von 3,5 Millionen Volksgenossen gegenüber gleichgültig zu sein und an ihrem Unglück keinen Anteil mehr zu nehmen.
Edvard Beneš, president of Czechoslovakia, pleads for British, French and Soviet security guarantees. The Czechs are massively outnumbered by the Germans, but have strong defences in the west, and will fight if they are supported by their allies. Instead, Britain and France ignore Soviet offers of cooperation and tell Beneš he must make major concessions to Hitler to save Europe from war.
So, I mean, that's pretty rich, huh? Yeah, so you're gonna have to really give some stuff up, because we don't want to protect you. And you're like, oh, great, thanks a lot. Ignores Soviet offers for cooperation, right? So you can see at this point, the West, you can call the Western countries, France, Britain, they do not want to work with the Soviets. However, the Soviets at this point, it's interesting because we'll get the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right, which was this shock alliance between the Nazis and the communists, which was shocking because both hated each other, they really did. So at this point, Stalin, the communists, they're still pretty fearful about Germany. That Germany, the Nazis, have laid out so much aggressive rhetoric against communists and the Soviets in particular. So the Soviets are worried that, we're not necessarily we're next, but eventually we're going to be on the chopping block. We're going to end up in a war with Hitler. At the time, if you were to guess, you probably would not have guessed that Hitler would be invading France before the Soviet Union. That's how it ended up. But I think the Soviets felt they had a lot more to fear than the French or the British. I think that the French and the British, well, I was going to say even though they didn't like Hitler, but actually, there were some politicians in Britain and France, some right-wingers, who actually kind of did like Hitler, which is part of this. But even those who didn't were sort of like, well, does this really affect us? It might not be good. It's not good for Czechoslovakia. It's not good for the balance of power. But do we really want to get involved? Get into a war over something that doesn't necessarily involve us that much? Well, it would involve them pretty soon.
But there is no concession Benesch can make that will pacify Hitler.
Right.
Or the Sudeten Germans, who stoke the crisis on his behalf. With Hitler apparently intent on war, Neville Chamberlain takes an unprecedented step. Sidelining the French, he flies to Germany himself to meet Hitler at his Bavarian mountaintop retreat.
We gotta look at how this goes. All I'm gonna say is Chamberlain always had too high an opinion of his own diplomatic abilities.
The Berghof. He is determined to resolve the Sudetenland question peacefully and prevent it spiraling into a European war, an outcome dreaded by most in Britain, France, and Germany. Fraught negotiations culminate 2 weeks later in a conference in Munich. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy are represented. Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union are not.
Interesting.
Ultimately,
Interesting. The Soviets, who wanted cooperation in the first place, they're not represented. And Czechoslovakia, who is the subject of all of this conversation, is not represented.
Hitler is compelled to back down from his threat of military action. The final agreement cedes the Sudetenland to Germany, with Hitler declaring he has no further demands on Czech territory. In the following weeks, both Hungary and Poland take advantage of Czechoslovakia's woes to enforce their own claims. Poland occupies Transalza with its large Polish population, while Hungary reclaims former territory in southern Slovakia.
So, once again, you can see that the nationalism, it extends beyond Germany, right? And I think, hopefully you understand that if countries were constantly trying to, claim territory with some of their nationality in it, all countries would constantly be at war with each other all the time. It's simply not feasible, right? Anyway, this is all heading towards disaster, of course.
Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Daladier are welcomed home as heroes, the men who have saved Europe from war. But their policy of appeasement is based on a fatal misreading of Hitler's character and intentions. They hope he will honor the commitments he has made at Munich.
Yeah, this is a very famous moment. Peace in our time, right? And obviously this becomes very ironic very quickly. And I think fairly so. I'm not a Chamberlain defender. Like I said, of course he couldn't see the future, but it was clear to some people, some critics at that time, that this was not the right path to take. And appeasement simply doesn't work with a character like Hitler, because if you had been paying attention, it was pretty clear that Hitler was just going further and further and further each time, and that each time he pushed, maybe he didn't get everything he wanted, but he was getting most of what he wanted, and so why would he not go the next step? And like I said, Chamberlain always had a higher opinion of his own diplomatic abilities, a higher opinion of his abilities than really existed, to be honest.
They believe he can be contained and deterred by their own rearmament plans, which now gather pace. But in truth, Hitler is infuriated to have been deprived of his little war in Czechoslovakia. And next time, assured of the weakness of Britain and France, he will insist on a military outcome.
Munich is a betrayal that will be its own punishment. Britain and France think they will save themselves from war and revolution at our expense, but they are wrong. Finish. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was saying, right? Britain and France, they feel like there's not that much at stake for them, so they're willing to sacrifice others to save themselves. But Benish is right, they're wrong, that they will not end up saving themselves. They're going to end up embroiled in war with everybody else.
For opponents of fascism everywhere, the Munich Agreement is a bitter blow. The disappointment is particularly severe among Republican forces in Spain, who struggle in the civil war against Franco's nationalists. 1938 sees bloody fighting at Teruel, then a nationalist offensive through Aragon that reaches the sea, cutting Republican Spain in two.
Yeah, and, it makes sense that the Republicans would be particularly disheartened by this, because, let's be honest, they're losing the military conflict against Franco, right? And they're, Franco is getting international support. He's relying on the international support he's getting mainly from Germany and Italy, who are sending guns, men, Germany sends its air force, the Luftwaffe, right? So Franco's getting a lot of backing, whereas the Republicans, they need international support to continue fighting, and they're simply not getting it. They're getting some from the Soviets, that's true, but they need more than that if they want to win this fight. And it's pretty clear that Britain and France are simply not willing to stand up to fascism on a global stage, at least not yet. And so, the Spanish Republicans they're not getting the backing that they need.
The Republicans launch a desperate counterattack across the Ebro River, but their armies are decimated in the heaviest fighting of the war.
Sheesh.
That November, in Paris, a German diplomat is murdered by a Jewish teenager. 2 nights later, in Germany, the Nazis respond by instigating a nationwide pogrom. Jews, their businesses, synagogues, and even cemeteries are targeted. The amount of broken glass spawns the name Kristallnacht. Hundreds of Jews.
Yes, Night of Broken Glass, right? And, I don't need to tell this to you guys, but of course, this is an extremely brutal event. And, what stands out is that, unfortunately, there have been pogroms against Jewish communities for a long time. It's been an occurrence, particularly in places like Russia. There were a lot of pogroms, for a long, you had the Pale of Settlement, which was sort of in Western Russia, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There were some pretty vicious pogroms happening over there. But, Jews had been, the victims of violence and anti-Semitism for a long, long time, right? This is not something new, obviously, but the sort of unique part of this is that a lot of the pogroms we talk about, right, in European history, there was a sort of a spontaneous nature to them, and they may have been sort of somewhat supported by local officials, or maybe local officials looked the other way. But here in Germany, you have, state-sponsored anti-Semitism and these state-sponsored pogroms, right? That's a new level. And of course, the Holocaust itself will be this, unprecedented state-sponsored industrial machine of violence and mass murder. We've never seen anything like it, right? But even at this point, you can see that you've taken this virulent, violent ideology and you've raised it to the highest level of your government, right? And this is the result.
Kristallnacht. Hundreds of Jews are killed. Around 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and held in concentration camps for several weeks. The violence and vandalism is widely reported by foreign journalists. Worldwide, Nazi barbarism is denounced, and the US recalls its ambassador. In East Asia, Japan's invasion of China continues, despite abortive peace talks instigated by the German ambassador. In March, the Japanese parliament passes a state general mobilization law, giving the government almost total control of the economy, industry, and media to meet the needs of war. That spring, there is heavy fighting around Suzhou as the Japanese try to link up their gains and seize control of the vital north-south railway. The fighting is ferocious, with around 1 million soldiers involved. In April, the Chinese win their first major victory over the Japanese at Taiyuan. It is a major morale boost, but heavy losses and the threat of encirclement force the Chinese to withdraw south.
Yeah, things have not been going well for the Chinese forces here, right? Japan has been advancing and advancing and advancing, winning battles and committing heinous atrocities against the population. And I know I've mentioned this before, but, some people see, 1937, right, when this new phase of the war, because Japan was already in Manchuria, but when this war begins between Japan and China, some historians see that as the beginning of the Second World War, because it flows continuously into the Second World War. I guess it depends on whether you take a more Eurocentric perspective, or more sort of Asian-centric or Pacific-centric perspective, what you're more focused on, but this is absolutely, the continuation of this conflict that will then bleed into the rest of this global world war.
The next battle will be fought for Wuhan. To slow the Japanese advance, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek makes an astonishingly ruthless decision.
Yeah.
He gives the order to open the dikes to deliberately flood the Yellow River basin. The civilian population receives no warning. As a direct consequence, an estimated 900,000 Chinese peasants lose their lives by drowning, starvation, or disease. 4 million become refugees. It is the most destructive man-made disaster in history.
It's honestly an indecipherable decision, right? It's an incredible act of brutality against your own people that, by the way, doesn't even slow the Japanese down, as we're about to see. It doesn't stop them. So it has no impact on the Japanese. It's brutal, it's immoral, it's stupid, right? It makes no sense, right? This is look, the nationalists were already not super well liked in China. This contributes to that, right? People see the nationalists as brutal, incompetent, and corrupt. And, they see the communists who are fighting against the Japanese and organizing In contrast, they see them as these sort of brave resistance fighters, right? I mean, there's a reason the communists gain so much support throughout the country and the nationalists lose support. It's due to decisions like this.
Nor does it save Wuhan.
No.
For more than 4 months, the biggest, bloodiest battle of the Sino-Japanese War rages.
I mean, what an absolute waste of life, you know, with that flood. I mean, it's just so, like I said, it's an indecipherable decision to me. Makes no sense.
Nearly 1.3 million troops are sucked into the fighting. The Chinese have superior numbers, but the Japanese have better training and more modern weaponry, including poison gas. The losses on both sides from combat and sickness are vast and difficult to establish. In October, the Japanese land at Canton and take the city against light resistance. This move severs the route by which approximately 80% of foreign supplies reach nationalist China and its armed forces.
Yeah, and, you know, Shanghai's already been taken, which was a real sort of center of international residence and culture and things like that, right? So they're trying to cut off the supply lines. The Chinese army is trying to cut off China from its international resources and supplies.
It also undercuts the strategic value of Wuhan, which finally falls to the Japanese later that month. But the stubborn Chinese defense buys time for Chiang to withdraw his surviving forces west, towards his new capital, Chongqing. Here they are protected by mountain ranges and the vastness of the Chinese interior.
Yeah, so China keeps fighting, but, I mean, you can see that the Chinese army has now pulled back into the interior of the country, and they've lost most of the sort of eastern portion of China and a lot of their most important cities, right? So things are not looking good for China, though once again the war continues. The nationalists hold the line, and the communists keep fighting, and throughout the war will really conduct these sort of guerrilla operations throughout Japanese-controlled territory.
Japan now occupies China's greatest cities, and controls an estimated 87% of the country's productive capacity.
Jesus.
But its conquests have come at a huge price in men and resources. And there is no sign of an imminent Chinese surrender. The Imperial Japanese Army is alarmed to find itself facing a military stalemate in a vast country, attacked by nationalist and communist guerrillas, and facing enormous logistical problems.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, Japan has been winning battle after battle. They find that they are militarily superior to the Chinese forces, and whenever there's a smaller engagement, they win. They take Manchuria, that's taken easily. You know, that's easy enough for them. However, this is a different beast. They're now trying to conquer the entirety of China, to defeat China entirely. You know, to do that, you need to win more than a few battles, right? China has got intense superiority in terms of numbers. There is so much space that the government and the nationalists can hold on to, and they can keep retreating through this territory. And trying to hold this territory will cause Japan a lot of grief, because the population will keep resisting the nationalists, the communists, right? And so this is different than what Japan has been doing so far. And it's, I mean, look, there's going to be years and years of fighting. China will not be freed for a while, but it's not going to go well for Japan.
They are desperate to find some means to end the war. Because to the north, they fear they will soon have to face a much more dangerous adversary. The Soviet Union. Border tensions have been escalating for years. That summer, fighting erupts at Lake Hassan, leaving hundreds dead on both sides. In 1939, it will be full-scale war. The next episode of our World War II series is going to be our most detailed and comprehensive yet. We're covering the slide to war in Europe, the unexpected bombshell of the Nazi-Soviet pact, the quagmire of Japan's invasion of China, and the devastating conquest of Poland. To watch this episode right now, and watch every new episode first, head over to Prestige streaming service Nebula.
Alrighty, so I will link this video down below so you can go and check it out. Give Extra History a like, subscribe to their channel, go and check out Nebula. Please show them support for making these incredible videos. This was another good one, of course. Next time we get 1939, which of course is when it all truly begins. I know this is called Road to World War II. I wonder if we'll keep going through the Second World War. I know they've got other content on the Second World War, but it does make you wonder if we'll get more on the conflict. I don't know. I guess we'll find out, but I'm definitely excited for that next video. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Thank you all for watching. Hope you're all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.